On the 12th of January, 1888, the temperature in Clark County, Kansas, dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. Not 3 hours, 3 minutes. That morning had been warm enough that children walked to school without coats. By nightfall, 235 people were dead across the Great Plains, most of them frozen within sight of their own front doors. One woman was found the next morning with her hands tangled in her brother's door handle, inches from safety. But there was a woman in Nebraska that week who wasn't afraid, not because she was brave, but because she was underground. Her name was Ruth Chrisman. She was 24 years old. She had bought a crumbling, half-collapsed root cellar for $2, and the 6-day blizzard of January 1888 never touched her. What she understood about the earth beneath her feet, and what every neighbor who laughed at her failed to grasp, is one of the most remarkable survival stories the frontier ever produced, and the physics behind it will genuinely change the way you think about the ground you're standing on. Let's go back to the fall of 1886. Ruth Chrisman had just filed a homestead claim in Custer County, Nebraska, alongside her 3 sisters, Hattie, Lizzie, and Lutie. The Homestead Act gave each of them 160 acres for an $18 filing fee. What it did not give them was any of the resources they actually needed to survive. The land the sisters received sat on a stretch of open Nebraska prairie where the nearest tree was 3 miles away. No lumber, no coal within purchasing distance. Their combined savings after the filing fees, the journey, and the first supply run totaled less than $11. When Ruth walked the boundary of her claim that October, she found one thing the land agent had not mentioned: a collapsed root cellar dug into a low hillside at the northwest corner of the property. The previous homesteader had abandoned his claim 2 years earlier, walked away, never proved it up, let the county auction the tax debt for almost nothing. The cellar's sod roof had caved in on one side. The door frame was rotted through. Weeds grew from the walls. Her neighbors, 2 brothers named August and Carl Stenner, who had staked claims on either side of her, took one look at it and laughed. "That's not a cellar," August told her. "That's a hole that gave up." He was building a proper lumber frame house. He had borrowed $240 from a Broken Bow bank to do it. Walls of pine board, a cast-iron stove that cost him $28, glass windows he'd hauled 60 miles by wagon. When winter came, he told Ruth, that stove would keep his family warm. Ruth spent $2 on the abandoned cellar, $2 for the tax debt transfer on the quarter-acre corner lot that contained it. In 1880s Nebraska, $2 bought you 44 pounds of flour, or 8 gallons of kerosene, or a wheelbarrow. She chose the hole in the ground. What she saw in that collapsed structure, nobody around her could see yet. She started work in the first week of November because she had no choice. The first hard frost was already past, and the frost line in central Nebraska drives 4 full feet into the ground by February. If the cellar floor wasn't below that depth, everything she stored would freeze solid. The existing excavation was already 8 feet deep, which was the one thing the previous homesteader had done right. Ruth recut the walls with a spade, squaring them and packing the loose soil tight. She collected sod blocks from the undisturbed prairie at the northern edge of her claim, the same method every Nebraska homesteader used, cutting ribbons of virgin sod with a breaking plow into blocks 2 feet long, 12 inches wide, and 4 inches thick. She restacked the walls 2 feet thick, staggering the joints the way a mason staggers bricks. She salvaged 3 cottonwood poles from a dry creek bed a quarter-mile east, dragged them back on a rope harness, and set them as roof rafters. Over those she laid coarse prairie grass, then 2 full layers of sod, grass side up. Within 2 weeks, the roof had knit itself back into the hillside. The door she built from scavenged fence boards. She sealed the gaps between planks with mud slurry, packed it in with a flat stick, let it dry, packed it again. She left 2 ventilation openings near the floor on the north wall and 1 near the ceiling on the south, using hollow sections of cottonwood log as channels. In severe cold, She plugged them with rags stuffed into wooden caps she carved herself. The entire repair cost her nothing beyond the $2 she had already paid, because every material came from the ground around her. August Stenner rode past while she was finishing the roof and called over from his horse. "You're going to winter in a dirt hole like a badger?" "A badger," Ruth called back, "doesn't freeze." November passed and December came. Ruth moved her food stores underground. 90 pounds of potatoes she hadn't washed, dirt shaken off, never washed, because moisture rots along with dried beans. Cured salt pork hanging from an iron hook she'd driven into the cottonwood rafter, 3 crocks of butter packed in brine, 24 jars of preserved tomatoes and corn she'd put up in September, and a 50-pound sack of ground wheat flour. She strung a rope from the cellar entrance to the lean-to where she kept her 2 chickens and a borrowed milk cow. She had read enough frontier accounts and absorbed enough practical wisdom from women who'd survived Nebraska winters before her to know that a person can die crossing 12 feet of open ground in a whiteout if they lose their bearings for even 30 seconds. The Stenner brothers thought she was being theatrical. Their pine-board walls by December were already showing what lumber does in a plains winter. It contracts in the cold, opening hairline gaps at every joint. Carl had packed the gaps with newspaper. The newspaper was already brown and brittle. Their stove burned through a full scuttle of coal every 6 hours. Here is where the physics becomes important, because what was happening below Ruth's feet while the Stenner brothers burned through their coal supply is one of the most counterintuitive facts in all of natural science. 8 feet below the Nebraska prairie, the earth has no idea what winter is, and that is not a figure of speech. The sun heats the surface every summer and winter, strips it bare, but that thermal cycle, that annual 100-degree swing between July and January propagates downward through soil the way a whisper travels through a thick wall. It gets slower and quieter with every inch of depth. By 3 feet down, the daily temperature swings you feel on the surface have already vanished entirely. By 8 feet, the seasonal swing that sends surface temperatures lurching between 30 degrees Fahrenheit and plus 100 degrees Fahrenheit above ground has shrunk to less than 10 degrees total. The temperature at that depth holds at roughly 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit in central Nebraska, year-round, with only a gentle seasonal drift of a few degrees in either direction. The reason is thermal mass. 1 cubic foot of moist Nebraska soil stores approximately 28 BTUs of heat energy per degree Fahrenheit of temperature change. That sounds abstract until you do the math. Ruth's root cellar was surrounded by roughly 1,500 cubic feet of soil on all sides. That soil mass commanded a thermal reserve of more than 40,000 BTUs per degree, meaning that for the surface temperature to drive the cellar down even 1 degree, it had to conduct enough heat out through 3 feet of earth to exhaust 40,000 BTUs. At the rate that heat moves through soil, that takes not hours but days. By the time a cold snap at the surface has finally begun to reach 8-foot depth, the surface has already started warming again. The January temperature record in Custer County during the winter of 1,888 shows surface lows reaching 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Ruth's cellar floor held at 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference was 76 degrees, and it came from nothing but depth. She kept a single tallow candle burning on the shelf near her sleeping pallet, less for warmth than for light and the small psychological comfort of a flame. The candle itself contributed perhaps 80 BTUs per hour. The earth contributed the rest, silently and continuously, the way it had been doing since before Nebraska was a word anyone knew. On January 10th, 1888, Ruth noticed her cow was uneasy. The animal had been restless since the previous afternoon, refusing feed, pressing her flank against the far wall of the lean-to. A neighbor woman 2 miles south, an older homesteader named Mrs. Barter, who had wintered the plains since 1871, had told Ruth the previous autumn that cattle read pressure changes in the air before any human instrument can register them. When cattle stop eating and face into the wind, Something is coming. Ruth spent the morning of January 11th plugging every vent opening with double-stuffed rags. She brought the cow and chickens into the cellar vestibule. She pulled the rope from house to lean-to and coiled it inside. She moved her fuel supply, a stack of dried corn stalks and twisted hay bundles she'd prepared in October, against the interior wall. She filled every available container with water from her well before the pump could freeze. August Stenner saw her carrying buckets and called across the fence line. "Weather's clear," he said. "What are you doing?" "Getting ready," she said. He shook his head and went inside to his warm pine house with its cast-iron stove. The morning of January 12th, 1888 broke at 32 degrees Fahrenheit across most of the Central Plains, mild enough for January that farmers worked outside without gloves, and children across Nebraska and Dakota walked to school without their heavy coats. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the storm front arrived. There was no warning system, no telegraph alert, no forecast. The Arctic air mass rolled down from Canada with winds reaching 60 miles per hour, driving snow so fine it behaved less like precipitation than like smoke penetrating every gap in every wall, every loose button on a coat, every eyelash. The temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes at multiple recording stations across the region. By nightfall, the thermometer at the Broken Bow station read 22 degrees Fahrenheit. By the following morning, stations across the territory were recording between 30 degrees Fahrenheit and 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The storm did not stop the next day, or the next, and it ran for 6 consecutive days. August Stenner's pine-board house, which had seemed so solid in October, turned lethal within the first 48 hours. The gaps Carl had packed with newspaper weren't gaps anymore. They were channels of 30 degrees Fahrenheit air, pouring through walls that lumber contraction had opened wide. The cast-iron stove ran continuously. They burned through their coal in 3 days, then burned furniture, then fence posts they dragged inside before the storm. By day 4, Carl Stenner walked the 40 yards to Ruth Chrisman's hillside in near whiteout conditions and knocked on her sod door with both fists. She let him in. The interior of the cellar was 49 degrees Fahrenheit. It smelled of damp earth and hay and the warm animal smell of the cow bedded in the corner. Ruth had a small fire going in an iron pot she'd set on the floor, burning twisted hay at a slow, controlled rate. The pot threw perhaps 2,000 BTUs an hour, the earth threw the rest. Carl Stenner had been outside for less than 4 minutes, crossing the 40 yards between houses, and his moustache was solid ice. He sat down on the dirt floor and started crying. August arrived 20 minutes later, having waited as long as his pride would let him, and he brought his wife and their 2 children. All 5 of them spent the remaining 4 days of the January 1888 blizzard underground in a room that cost Ruth Chrisman $2 and 3 weeks of work. Here is what Ruth understood that August Stenner did not, and what you can now explain to anyone who asks. A wood-frame house sits on top of the earth and fights the cold from above, relying entirely on whatever fuel you can burn to replace the heat bleeding out through every wall and window. When the fuel runs out, and on the plains, it always ran out the house, becomes a box that traps you at the same temperature as the air outside. A root cellar sits inside the earth and borrows heat from a source that no blizzard can reach. The earth at 8 feet in Nebraska has been absorbing summer heat for millions of years, and that stored thermal energy, tens of thousands of BTUs, locked in the mineral and water mass of the surrounding soil, radiates slowly and continuously into any below-grade space. It doesn't care what's happening at the surface, and it doesn't run out. This is geothermal buffering, not the dramatic kind involving geysers or volcanoes, but the quiet, invisible kind that exists beneath every farm in the Great Plains. The mean annual temperature of the ground at depth matches the mean annual air temperature of that location, plus 2 to 3 degrees. In Nebraska, that holds at 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, stabilized by the thermal inertia of millions of tons of earth. The thermal wave from a January blizzard takes weeks to propagate even a few feet downward, and by the time it arrives, spring has already begun at the surface. Pioneer women who understood this, who dug deep instead of building tall, consistently outlasted the ones who didn't. Ruth Chrisman proved up her 160-acre homestead claim in 1891. Her sister Lizzie filed her own claim that same year, and Hattie and Lootie followed. Solomon Butcher, the Nebraska photographer who documented homesteader life across Custer County in the 1880s and 1890s, photographed the Chrisman sisters at their claims, and that image became one of the most reproduced photographs of frontier women in American history. The root cellar at the northwest corner of Ruth's property survived 3 more blizzards after January 1888, including the brutal back-to-back storms of the winter of 1,891,891. The pine-board house August Stenner had borrowed $240 to build was abandoned by 1893. The lumber had warped, the foundation had heaved, and he had never found a coal supply reliable enough to heat it through a full plains winter. The cellar needed no coal and no lumber. It needed only the 50 to 54 degrees the earth had always been willing to offer, at no cost, to anyone willing to dig deep enough to reach it.